The morning of Dean Martin's funeral arrived wrapped in a silence that felt heavier than grief. Lowe's angels had seen stars fade before, but this was different. This was not the death of a headline or a tabloid legend. This was the passing of a man whose power had never needed noise. Outside the cathedral, crowds gathered without shouting, without cameras flashing wildly, without the chaos that usually followed Hollywood farewells. People stood quietly, as if instinctively aware that Dean Martin deserved something rarer than spectacle. He deserved respect. Inside, the air carried the soft weight of memory. The marble walls reflected muted light, and the scent of old wood and incense blended into something almost comforting. There were actors seated beside stagehands, singers beside waiters, men in tailored suits beside men whose hands still bore the marks of long labor. This was not accidental. This was the echo of a life lived with quiet reach. Dean Martin had never announced his goodness. He had practiced it. Over decades, he had opened doors without making speeches, paid debts he did not owe, and used his influence not to dominate rooms, but to soften them. For those who knew the deeper story, this funeral was not only about loss, it was about reckoning. Part one of this story had already revealed how Dean Martin, years earlier, had intervened when Muhammad Ali was humiliated behind closed doors at an exclusive event, using nothing but calm words and his refusal to play along with injustice. That moment had changed Ali's view of Hollywood forever. It had also changed Dean's. He had understood then that dignity, once defended, demanded consistency. It demanded that silence never become complicity. Now, years later, the men who once dismissed Dean as merely charming or unserious sat rigid in their seats, haunted by the realization that the moral center of the room was gone. Dean Martin had been many things to many people, but to those who truly saw him, he had been a quiet line that could not be crossed, and now that line was gone. Muhammad Ali arrived late. There was no dramatic entrance, no entourage, no grand gesture. He walked in slowly, shoulders bowed in a way the world had never seen. This was not the Ali of roaring arenas or defiant press conferences. This was a man stripped of armor. The crowd noticed immediately, not because he demanded attention, but because grief radiated from him like heat. Conversations softened, heads turned, and then, almost without instruction, the room became still. Ali took a seat near the front, close enough to the casket that he did not need to lean forward to see Dean's face. The polished wood reflected faint light, but there was nothing theatrical about it. Dean Martin looked as he always had in rest, composed, peaceful, dignified even in death. There was no forced smile, no exaggerated styling. It was as if he had simply chosen silence as his final line. The service began with music, gentle and restrained. A singer's voice trembled, not from lack of skill, but from the weight of singing for a man who had once carried the burden of entire rooms so others did not have to. Stories were shared, but none were loud. Anecdotes about Dean's humor were told softly, with affection rather than exaggeration. Laughter came in brief, respectful waves, quickly swallowed by reflection. Then came a pause that was not planned. The officiant had just finished speaking when the sound broke through the stillness. It was not a sob at first. It was a breath that failed to hold itself together. Muhammad Ali's shoulders shook once, then again, and then the strength he had shown the world for decades finally surrendered. His hands came up to his face. and the room watched as one of the most powerful men in modern history began to cry openly. This was not performative grief. This was collapse. Ali had faced hatred with defiance, illness with courage, and loss with public composure. But this was different. This was the grief of a man who had lost not just a friend, but a witness. Dean Martin had seen him at his most vulnerable, had defended him when doing so carried social cost, and had never asked for gratitude in return. Ali had once said that fame taught you who wanted your power, not who protected your humanity. Dean had protected his humanity. The injustice that haunted Ali now was not new. It had followed him his entire life. The slurs disguised as jokes, the exclusion dressed as tradition, the doors closed politely but firmly. Dean Martin had never pretended those things did not exist. He had simply refused to benefit from them. And in a world where refusal was rare, that mattered. Ali stood. There was a murmur, then silence again. He did not approach the podium. He did not look at the crowd. He walked slowly to the casket, each step deliberate, as if he were entering a private space rather than a public one. When he reached Dean, he placed one hand gently on the polished surface and leaned down. What he whispered was not meant for the room, but the room would never forget it. His voice was low, broken, but clear enough for those closest to hear fragments. He did not speak of fame. He did not speak of legacy. He spoke of a night long ago when he had been made to feel small, when powerful men had laughed while expecting silence, and when Dean Martin had stood beside him and said, calmly, that he would not stay in a place where dignity was optional. Ali whispered that Dean had taught him that courage did not always shout. Sometimes it simply stayed. Then Ali said something that shattered the room. He thanked Dean for loving him, when loving him was inconvenient. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, full of regret from those who had failed that test, full of gratitude from those who had witnessed Dean's quiet defiance, full of understanding from people who realized, perhaps too late, that true power rarely announces itself. Ali straightened, wiped his face, and turned toward the crowd. He did not lecture. He did not accuse. He simply said that the world would speak loudly about Dean Martin's talent, his charm, his humor, but that the truest measure of a man was how he behaved when no one would punish him for doing wrong. And Dean Martin, Ali said, had chosen right when choosing wrong would have been easier. There were tears then, not just from Ali, but from hardened men who had built careers on indifference, from women who had seen doors closed and opened by the same hands, from people who realized that they had mistaken noise for strength their entire lives. The injustice was named without spectacle, racism condemned without shouting, cruelty exposed without cruelty in return. Dean Martin's life had been a rebuke delivered softly, and Ali's grief now completed that sentence. As the service ended, people did not rush to leave. They sat in silence, absorbing the weight of what had been said and what had not. Outside, reporters waited, but Ali did not speak to them. He walked past quietly, eyes forward, carrying something heavier than sorrow and lighter than anger. He carried gratitude. In the days that followed, stories emerged, not scandals, not gossip, but testimonies. Waiters spoke of Dean intervening when guests were mistreated. Musicians remembered contracts rewritten to protect younger artists. Actors recalled moments when a single look from Dean had ended cruelty mid-sentence. None of these stories contradicted the man Ali had mourned. They confirmed him. The whisper at the casket became legend, not because of what was said, but because of what it revealed. Dean Martin had never needed to be the loudest voice in the room. He had been the one that mattered when the room fell quiet. And in that quiet, justice had lived. The final image people carried from that day was not of Hollywood glamour or celebrity grief. It was of a fighter brought to his knees by kindness, mourning a man who had understood that dignity was not a performance, but a practice. Dean Martin had practiced it until his last breath. And when Muhammad Ali stood alone beside that casket, whispering thanks through tears, the world understood something it had long ignored. Strength does not always roar. Sometimes it stands still, says very little, and changes everything. The days after the funeral did not move forward the way time usually does. They stretched, slowed, and folded inward, as if the world itself needed a moment to adjust to Dean Martin's absence. Hollywood resumed its rhythms on the surface. Premieres continued. Contracts were signed. Laughter returned to studios. But something essential had shifted beneath it all. For those who had known Dean beyond the stage lights, his death did not feel like an ending. It felt like a question that had been left behind. Muhammad Ali felt that question most sharply. He returned to his home, carrying a silence heavier than the one inside the cathedral. The whisper he had given Dean stayed with him, not as words, but as a presence. Ali had spent his life fighting visible opponents, but this grief had no shape, no ring, no referee to step in. It followed him through quiet rooms and sleepless nights, reminding him that the man who once stood beside him without asking for permission was gone. And with that realization came something more unsettling. Ali began to notice how often Dean Martin's name surfaced in moments of moral discomfort. A young singer mentioned how Dean had once refused to perform unless a black musician was allowed to sit in the front row. A retired stage manager recalled Dean shutting down a producer who tried to humiliate a janitor for speaking out of turn. These stories were not grand acts. They were corrections, small, precise, and final. Dean had never made injustice dramatic. He had made it unacceptable. The injustice that now pressed forward was quieter but no less dangerous. Without Dean's presence, certain old habits began to return. Exclusive gatherings resumed their unspoken rules. Invitations were extended selectively again. Respect became conditional once more, wrapped in politeness but stripped of sincerity. Ali felt it immediately. It was not aimed at him directly. That was the clever part. It was aimed at those who did not yet have his name, his legacy, his shield. One evening, Ali was invited to a private industry dinner honoring American entertainment history. Dean's name appeared on the invitation as a tribute, a symbol, a safe reference to a past everyone suddenly claimed to admire. Ali accepted, uneasy but curious. He wanted to see how Dean's memory was being used. The room was elegant, dimly lit, designed to feel intimate while reinforcing hierarchy. Ali noticed the seating before the first course was served. Young artists of color were placed at the edges, near the walls, far from the center tables where influence gathered. The pattern was familiar, nothing explicit, nothing illegal, just old instincts quietly reasserting themselves. Ali felt anger rise, but he also felt Dean's presence beside him, calm and steady, reminding him that outrage alone rarely changed anything. Dean had never confronted injustice with spectacle. He had confronted it with position, with refusal, with quiet authority. Ali waited. As the evening progressed, a speaker took the stage to praise Dean Martin's legacy. The words were polished, reverent, and empty. Dean was described as charming, effortless, beloved. Nothing was said about his courage, nothing about the lines he refused to cross. Ali felt the disconnect like a physical ache. They were celebrating the version of Dean that made them comfortable, not the one who made them better. When applause faded, Ali stood. The room froze, unsure whether this was planned. Ali did not smile. He did not raise his voice. He spoke slowly, deliberately, as if each word needed permission to exist. He thanked the speaker, thanked the organizers, and then said that Dean Martin would have appreciated the beauty of the evening, but he would have noticed something else first. Ali gestured gently toward the edges of the room, toward the faces that had been taught to stay quiet. He said that Dean had taught him that respect was not proven by praise, but by placement. That dignity was revealed not in words spoken about the absent, but in choices made for the present. Ali did not accuse anyone directly. He did not name wrongdoing. He simply asked whether Dean Martin would have sat comfortably at a table that required others to be invisible. The silence that followed was sharp. Ali did not wait for an answer. He took his place beside the far tables, pulling out a chair, inviting conversation where exclusion had been designed. Others followed, slowly at first, then all at once. The room reorganized itself without instruction. The center dissolved. Hierarchy weakened. Discomfort gave way to something closer to honesty. No one applauded. They did not need to. That night marked a turning point Ali had not planned but understood deeply. Dean Martin's influence had not ended at the casket. It had transferred. Ali realized that the greatest injustice would be allowing Dean's legacy to be reduced to nostalgia. Dean had not been a symbol, he had been a standard. In the weeks that followed, Ali spoke less publicly about Dean and acted more privately in his name. He declined invitations that required silence. He supported younger voices without attaching his own spotlight. He corrected rooms the way Dean had, not with anger, but with presence. People began to notice, not because Ali announced it, but because the rooms changed when he entered them. Dean Martin's quiet authority lived on, not as imitation, but as continuation. And Ali understood then what that whisper at the funeral had truly meant. Dean had not only protected him in a moment of humiliation, he had entrusted him with something heavier, the responsibility to remain composed when outrage was tempting, the responsibility to choose dignity when power made cruelty easy. Part 2 of this story was not about grief anymore. It was about inheritance. And the world was about to learn that some legacies do not fade. They wait for the right hands to carry them forward. The shift did not announce itself loudly. It rarely does when real change begins. It started in smaller rooms, quieter conversations, and invitations that were rewritten after Ali declined them without explanation. People spoke Dean Martin's name more carefully now, not as decoration, but as a mirror. And mirrors have a way of making people uncomfortable. Part 3 began on a soundstage far from the elegance of memorial halls and industry dinners. It was an aging studio lot, one that had seen better decades. where a television special was being filmed to honor classic American entertainment. Dean Martin's image was everywhere that day, projected on screens, printed in programs, framed as timeless charm. Ali had been asked to appear briefly, to lend gravitas, to bridge eras. He agreed, not out of obligation, but curiosity. He wanted to see how far Dean's absence had stretched. Behind the scenes, Ali noticed tension before he saw its source. A young black comedian stood near a prop table, hands clasped tightly, listening as a producer spoke to him with a smile that did not reach his eyes. The words themselves were polite, but the message was unmistakable. Tone it down. Do not upset the room. Keep it light. The producer framed it as advice, but it was control wearing civility. Ali did not intervene immediately. Dean would not have rushed. Dean would have observed first, allowed truth to reveal itself. Ali watched as the comedian nodded, shrinking slightly, his confidence leaking away not because he lacked talent, but because he had learned what resistance cost. Ali recognized that posture. He had lived inside it once. The injustice here was not explosive. It was systematic. It was the kind that trained people to censor themselves before anyone else had to. And Ali understood something then that deepened his grief all over again. Dean Martin had spent years quietly interrupting moments like this, not because they were dramatic, but because they were dangerous. They taught people where they belonged. Later, during rehearsal, the comedian's set was flat, not because the jokes were weak, but because fear had drained them of truth. Laughter came politely, then stopped. The producer frowned, irritated, confirming his own bias. Ali felt the room leaning toward the easy conclusion. Talent is unreliable. Risk is unnecessary. Safety is smarter. Ali stood from his chair. He walked onto the stage without permission, without announcement, his presence enough to halt rehearsal. The producer opened his mouth to object, then thought better of it. Ali asked the comedian to tell the joke he had wanted to tell before the notes. Not louder, not safer, the real one. The room held its breath. The comedian hesitated, glanced at the producer, then looked at Ali. Ali nodded once. Calm, certain. The joke came out rough at first, then steadier, fueled by something that had been denied minutes earlier. Honesty. It was sharp but not cruel, observational without being hateful. It spoke of invisible lines, of being welcome only as long as one did not rearrange the furniture of comfort. The laughter this time was different, not polite, not controlled. It rolled through the room in waves, surprising even the people laughing. Ali did not smile. He watched. Dean Martin would have watched like this, measuring not volume but reaction, measuring whether dignity had been restored. When the laughter faded, Ali turned to the producer and said quietly that Dean Martin had once told him that the room belonged to whoever told the truth bravely enough to stand in it. Ali added that Dean had never been afraid of discomfort, only of dishonesty. Then Ali stepped off the stage and returned to his seat. No argument followed. None was needed. The producer adjusted the set list without comment. The comedian was given more time. The atmosphere shifted, not because Ali demanded it, but because no one wanted to be the one to contradict Dean Martin's shadow. After filming wrapped, the young comedian approached Ali, gratitude written across his face, mixed with disbelief. Ali placed a hand on his shoulder and said something simple. He said that talent was not enough in rooms like these. Composure mattered, patience mattered, and knowing when to wait and when to stand mattered most of all. That night, Ali drove home alone. The city lights blurred past, and for the first time since the funeral, his grief softened into something steadier. He realized that Dean Martin had not only modeled dignity, he had modeled timing. Dean had known when to act and when to let the moment expose itself. Ali was still learning that rhythm. The next injustice arrived sooner than expected. A newspaper column appeared days later, praising the revival of classic entertainment values while criticizing what it called unnecessary modern sensitivities. The article referenced Dean Martin repeatedly, implying that men like him would have disliked confrontation, would have preferred charm over challenge. Ali read the piece slowly, recognizing the manipulation. Dean's silence was being rewritten as approval. This time, Ali did not attend a dinner or a studio. He wrote a letter. It was published without fanfare. Ali did not attack the columnist. He did not accuse him of malice. He simply clarified. He wrote that Dean Martin's calm was not avoidance. It was discipline. That his charm was not surrender. It was strategy. Ali explained that Dean had never confused politeness with permission, and that honoring Dean meant refusing to use his name to excuse injustice. The response was immediate and divided. Some praised Ali's restraint. Others accused him of rewriting history. Ali accepted both reactions with the same composure Dean would have. He knew now that resistance dressed in dignity often unsettled those who preferred noise. Part 3 closed not with applause or headlines, but with something quieter. Young artists began reaching out to Ali, not for endorsements, but for guidance, not asking how to fight, but how to endure without becoming bitter. Ali answered selectively, carefully, understanding that influence was a finite resource. Dean had taught him that too. The injustice had not vanished, but it had been named. And once named, it could no longer hide behind nostalgia. Dean Martin's legacy continued its work, not as memory, but as motion. And Ali was no longer just mourning a friend. He was carrying a responsibility that grew heavier with every room he entered. The world was watching now, not to see if Ali would shout, but to see if he would remain still when stillness mattered most. By the time Part 4 began, the pressure had changed shape. It was no longer subtle. It no longer hid behind polite smiles or careful seating charts. The resistance to what Ali was doing had grown tired of quiet correction. People who had once admired Dean Martin's restraint now felt threatened by its continuation. And like all threatened systems, they reached for something familiar: control. The invitation arrived on heavy paper, embossed with prestige and urgency. It was for a televised anniversary gala celebrating American entertainment history, one designed to reach millions. Dean Martin's image would anchor the night. Archival footage, tributes, carefully edited laughter. Ali was listed as a featured speaker. This was not a casual appearance. This was a platform. Ali understood immediately why it mattered. This was the moment when Dean's legacy would be sealed publicly, not by those who lived it, but by those who curated it. Ali accepted the invitation with measured calm, aware that this would not be a room that could be rearranged quietly. Cameras do not tolerate ambiguity. They demand resolution. Rehearsals revealed the tension quickly. Ali's segment was scheduled after a montage celebrating unity, carefully scripted, comfortably vague. His remarks were expected to be brief, inspirational, and non-disruptive. A producer approached him with notes, speaking softly, respectfully, explaining that the network wanted the night to feel uplifting, not confrontational. Ali listened without interruption, the way Dean would have, allowing the man to finish without embarrassment. Then Ali asked one question. He asked whether Dean Martin had ever used a microphone to avoid saying something important. The producer hesitated, then smiled uncertainly, offering something about timing and tone. Ali nodded, thanked him, and said nothing more, but the air shifted. The producer walked away aware that something had already been decided beyond his reach. The injustice this time was larger, more visible, and more carefully protected. It was the attempt to turn history into comfort, to sand down the edges of men who had challenged the room quietly but firmly. Ali knew that if he spoke plainly on that stage, there would be backlash. If he remained vague, Dean's legacy would be softened into harmlessness. The night of the gala arrived with controlled grandeur. Lights swept across the audience. Applause rose on cue. Dean Martin's image filled the screen, younger, smiling, effortless. Laughter followed, warm and nostalgic. The room relaxed into memory. Ali waited. When his name was announced, the applause was immediate and loud. Ali walked to the microphone slowly, allowing the noise to settle on its own. He stood still, hands resting lightly on the podium, and said nothing at first. The silence stretched. Viewers at home leaned forward. Producers shifted in their seats. Ali began by thanking the audience for honoring Dean Martin. He spoke of Dean's grace, his professionalism, his humor, nothing unexpected. The room exhaled. Then Ali changed direction, so gently that many did not notice until it was too late. He said that Dean Martin had once taught him that the most dangerous lies were the ones that felt kind, that pretending harmony existed where injustice remained did not protect peace. It protected discomfort. Ali's voice remained calm, almost conversational, but the words carried weight. He told a brief story, not naming names, not accusing institutions, describing a moment years earlier when he had been asked to stay quiet so others could stay comfortable. He explained that Dean had stood beside him then, not with anger, but with refusal. Dean had simply chosen not to participate in a room that required someone else to disappear. The room grew still. Ali looked directly into the camera now, speaking to those watching at home. He said that honoring Dean Martin meant more than replaying his laughter. It meant practicing his courage. It meant asking who was still being asked to shrink so celebrations could continue uninterrupted. This was the turning point. Ali did not raise his voice. He did not demand change. He ended by saying that Dean Martin had believed dignity was not loud, but it was not negotiable either. That if this gala truly honored Dean, it would not fear honest reflection. Then Ali stepped back. There was a pause that felt like an eternity. Applause followed, hesitant at first, then building, uneven but undeniable. Some clapped out of respect, others out of discomfort. A few did not clap at all, but no one could pretend they had not heard him. Backstage, tension erupted. Producers whispered urgently. Executives argued in hushed tones. Ali passed through without stopping, acknowledging no one, his face composed, his posture steady. Dean would have walked like this. Ali felt it with certainty. The fallout arrived quickly in private calls and public commentary. Some accused Ali of politicizing a tribute. Others praised his restraint and clarity. Ali did not respond. Dean had never chased approval. Ali would not either. What mattered came later. Viewers wrote letters. Not fans, not activists, but ordinary people who recognized themselves in the story Ali told. People who had learned to stay quiet for survival. People who had mistaken politeness for peace. They thanked Ali not for speaking loudly, but for speaking carefully. Part 4 closed not with victory, but with consequence. The injustice had been confronted on its largest stage yet, not with confrontation, but with composure. Dean Martin's legacy had resisted being softened into nostalgia. And Ali understood now that carrying that legacy meant accepting isolation as often as admiration. The cost of dignity had always been loneliness. Dean Martin had paid it quietly for years. Now Ali was learning what that price felt like. And he was not finished paying it yet. The aftermath of the gala did not explode the way critics had predicted. There were no public scandals, no official apologies, no dramatic reversals announced in press releases. Instead, something more unsettling occurred. The noise faded, and what remained was distance. Invitations slowed. Conversations shortened. Doors that once opened easily now required effort. Ali felt it immediately, not as punishment, but as withdrawal. This was how systems protected themselves when force was ineffective. They did not attack, they isolated. Part 5 unfolded in that quieter terrain. Ali had known isolation before, but this was different. It was not imposed by hatred or open hostility. It was wrapped in civility. People still smiled, still praised him publicly, still spoke of Dean Martin with reverence, but the private warmth was gone. Ali was no longer a welcome symbol. He had become a reminder, and reminders make people uneasy. One afternoon, Ali was asked to meet with a senior figure from the entertainment establishment, a man whose career stretched back into Dean Martin's era, someone who spoke often about legacy and tradition. The meeting took place in a private office lined with photographs of legends, Dean among them. The man spoke calmly, almost kindly, explaining that Ali's recent actions, while admirable in intent, had complicated things. Sponsors were nervous. Audiences preferred celebration to reflection. Honoring Dean, he suggested, did not require revisiting old discomforts. Ali listened the way Dean would have, without interruption, without defensiveness. When the man finished, Ali looked at the photographs on the wall and asked a simple question. He asked whether Dean Martin had ever avoided discomfort to protect convenience. The man did not answer directly. He spoke instead about eras, about different times, about context. Ali nodded, thanked him for his honesty, and stood to leave. There was no argument. None was needed. The meeting ended not in anger, but in clarity. Ali understood then that the resistance he faced was not to his words, but to the standard those words represented. Dean Martin's composure had always been threatening precisely because it offered no excuse for cruelty. The injustice now was not singular, it was cumulative. It was the slow erosion of truth through selective remembrance. Dean Martin was being celebrated as charm without courage, elegance without ethics. Ali felt the weight of that distortion deeply. It was not just about Dean anymore. It was about how history was shaped by those who survived it. The turning point came unexpectedly, far from studios and stages. Ali was invited to speak at a small community event honoring local artists, one without cameras or prestige. He almost declined, exhausted by the strain of carrying expectations, but something compelled him to go. The room was modest. Folding chairs, simple lighting. Young performers sat alongside older residents, faces open, unguarded. Ali spoke briefly, not about fame or struggle, but about a man named Dean Martin who once taught him that dignity did not require permission. He spoke about how injustice often hid in comfort, and how refusing to participate quietly was sometimes the most powerful action available. There was no applause afterward, only thoughtful silence. After the event, a woman approached Ali. She was older, her voice steady, her hands trembling slightly. She told Ali that she had worked in entertainment her entire life, always behind the scenes, always invisible. She said that Dean Martin had once noticed her being spoken to dismissively and had corrected the moment with a glance and a word, never raising his voice, never humiliating anyone. She said she had never told that story publicly because no one had asked. Ali realized then what part 5 truly was. It was not about confrontation anymore. It was about testimony. Dean Martin's legacy had not lived in grand gestures. It lived in accumulated moments that people carried quietly for decades. Ali understood that the greatest injustice now would be allowing those stories to remain buried because they were inconvenient. Ali began inviting those stories forward, not through platforms but through presence, private conversations, quiet encouragement. He did not frame them as accusations or expose. He framed them as truth. People spoke hesitantly at first, then with relief, not because they sought validation, but because they wanted the record to be honest. These stories did not dismantle institutions overnight. They did something slower and more lasting. They complicated the narrative. They made it impossible to celebrate Dean Martin without acknowledging the moral spine that had guided his life. And once that spine was visible, it became harder for others to pretend they did not see it. Ali paid a price for this work. He felt the loneliness Dean must have known intimately, the weight of always being composed, always measured, always restrained. But he also felt something steadier growing beneath the strain: purpose. Part 5 closed with Ali standing alone in his home, looking at a photograph of Dean Martin taken years before. Dean's expression calm, eyes sharp, mouth resting in that familiar half-smile that suggested he saw more than he said. Ali understood now that Dean had never expected to be remembered correctly. He had expected to be practiced. The injustice had shifted again. It was no longer about exclusion in rooms or distortion on stages. It was about whether truth would be carried forward gently or allowed to disappear quietly. Ali knew his answer. Dean Martin had shown him how to stand. Now Ali was learning how to stay, the way true endings often do. There was no final stage to stand on, no microphone waiting, no audience expecting resolution. Instead, there was a quiet morning, light coming through a window, and the steady awareness that something had reached completion. The invitations never fully returned. Ali accepted that. He had learned from Dean Martin that approval was never the measure of a life lived correctly. What mattered was coherence, that your private choices did not contradict your public words, that your silence did not protect harm, that your calm did not excuse injustice. Dean had lived that way until the end, and Ali now felt that rhythm settle into his own bones. Months after the gala, a private memorial gathering was organized, not by networks or studios, but by people Dean Martin had touched quietly over the years. No cameras were invited, no press releases issued. Ali attended without announcement, taking a seat among them rather than apart. Stories were shared slowly, not for impact, but for accuracy. A musician spoke of Dean refusing to headline unless a black bandleader received equal billing. A wardrobe assistant recalled Dean intervening when a producer mocked her accent. A club owner admitted that Dean had once walked out rather than perform for a segregated audience, costing himself money without complaint. There was no applause after these stories, only nods, recognition, relief. Ali listened, understanding now that this was the true inheritance. Not influence, not reputation, but testimony. Dean Martin's life had been a series of small refusals that together formed a moral architecture stronger than any monument. Ali realized that his role had never been to replace Dean, nor to amplify him. It had been to prevent erasure. The final injustice revealed itself in that realization. The greatest wrong had never been the insults or exclusions or quiet humiliations. It had been the attempt to rewrite goodness as neutrality, to praise kindness while stripping it of courage, to remember charm while forgetting choice. Ali stood near the end of the gathering, not to speak, but to close the room. He said only that Dean Martin had taught him that dignity was not something you defended once. It was something you practiced daily, especially when no one was watching. Ali thanked everyone for refusing to let those moments vanish into silence. Outside, the evening air was calm. People lingered, talking softly, exchanging contact information, promising to stay in touch. Ali watched them with a feeling that surprised him. Peace, not triumph, not satisfaction, peace. Later that night, Ali returned home and sat alone, the quiet no longer heavy. He thought of the funeral, of the whisper at the casket, of the weight that had followed him for so long. He understood now why it had hurt the way it did. Dean Martin had not simply been a friend. He had been a standard bearer, and standards do not disappear when the person carrying them is gone. They wait. Ali also understood something else, something Dean had known all along. Justice did not require anger to survive. It required memory, composure, the willingness to stand still when pressure demanded surrender, the courage to refuse without cruelty. The world moved on, as it always does. New stars rose. New controversies distracted attention. Dean Martin's name returned to headlines occasionally, often reduced again to charm and nostalgia. Ali did not chase those moments anymore. He trusted the quieter work, the conversations that happened in hallways, the moments when someone chose not to laugh at a cruel joke, the rooms that rearranged themselves without being told. Those were Dean Martin's victories. And they continued. The story ended not with a final tribute, but with continuity. Ali carried Dean's legacy the way Dean had lived his life, without announcement, without spectacle, with restraint that spoke louder than outrage ever could. In time, Ali himself would be remembered for many things: his brilliance, his courage, his voice. But somewhere within that memory, quieter and steadier, would live the influence of a man who taught him that the strongest response to injustice was not noise, but refusal. Dean Martin had changed the room once with a few calm words. Through Ali, that change kept moving. Not loudly, not violently, but unmistakably. And that was enough.